A wealthy student mocks his teacher in front of the entire class, confident that his status gives him the upper hand. But instead of losing control, she does something no one expects. She challenges him to prove his intelligence. As the questions get harder, his confidence starts to crack and the class watches in silence. Will he manage to outsmart her, or will he be the one left humiliated? And when the lesson is over, who will truly walk away with the upper hand? A prestigious classroom, filled with the sons and daughters of society's elite, hummed with quiet chatter as students settled into their seats. At the front of the room stood Miss Johnson, a poised and highly qualified teacher ready to begin her lesson. Dressed in a sleek green dress, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned her place. Not that it stopped the occasional whispers from those who believed wealth dictated authority. Among them sat Ethan, a smirking, privileged student who had always believed respect was something others owed him, not something he had to earn. As Miss Johnson turned to write on the board, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his voice laced with arrogance as he muttered just loud enough for the class to hear, "I don't get why we have to learn from someone like her." A few students chuckled, some shifting uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. For a brief moment, the room went silent. Tension thick in the air. All eyes turned to Miss Johnson, expecting an outburst, maybe even a trip to the principal's office, for Ethan. But instead of anger, a slow, knowing smile crossed her lips. She turned back to face him, her gaze calm and unwavering. "That's an interesting perspective, Ethan," she said smoothly. "Let's put it to the test, shall we?" The class sat up, curiosity flashing in their eyes. No one expected what she did next. Have you ever seen someone put a bully in their place with pure intelligence? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. The classroom at Hillsworth Academy was nothing short of luxurious. Rows of polished wooden desks, high-tech smartboards, and tall windows overlooking the pristine school gardens set the scene. Every student sat neatly in their custom-fitted uniforms, a mark of the wealth and prestige their families carried. The air in the room was heavy with entitlement. These were the children of CEOs, politicians, and celebrities, raised in a world where money often spoke louder than merit. At the front of the room stood Miss Johnson, a woman whose presence commanded respect, though not all were willing to give it. Dressed in an elegant green dress, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had worked twice as hard to be here. A highly educated and passionate teacher, she had spent years navigating classrooms where her intelligence was sometimes questioned simply because of who she was. But she never let it break her. She believed in teaching through intellect, not anger. Among the students sat Ethan, leaning back in his chair with an air of arrogance. The son of a billionaire investor, he was used to getting his way. At school, at home, in life. To him, respect wasn't something earned through knowledge or experience. It was something dictated by status. He had made a habit of mocking teachers he considered beneath his family's wealth, and Miss Johnson was no exception. His friends often laughed along, either entertained by his remarks or too afraid to challenge him. The class had grown used to his behavior, but today something felt different. A few students glanced between Ethan and Ms. Johnson, sensing a shift in the usual dynamic. A teacher's assistant, standing near the back, frowned slightly, perhaps realizing that Ethan was about to push too far. Everyone expected Ms. Johnson to ignore it, the way other teachers did when faced with students like Ethan. But as she turned to face him, a knowing glint in her eye, it became clear. This time, things would not go the way he expected. The morning sun cast a golden hue through the grand windows of Hillsworth Academy, illuminating the polished desks as Miss Johnson began her lesson. She moved with poise, her voice steady as she introduced a thought-provoking discussion on historical revolutions and their impact on modern society. The class, dressed in their pristine uniforms, listened with varying levels of attention. Some genuinely engaged, others doodling in the margins of their notebooks. At the back of the room, Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his signature smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He had never been one to take lessons too seriously, especially not from a teacher he didn't believe belonged in a place like this. With a casual chuckle, loud enough for the class to hear, he interrupted. "You know, I don't get why we need to learn all this. Pretty sure my family hires people like you to handle these things for us." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Some students chuckled along not because they necessarily agreed, but because Ethan was the kind of person people laughed with, even when they shouldn't. Others, however, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the line that had just been crossed. The teacher's assistant near the back stiffened slightly, eyes darting toward Ms. Johnson, waiting to see how she would respond. Ms. Johnson didn't react immediately. She simply stood there, her expression unreadable, letting the silence stretch, longer than expected. The weight of it grew, pressing down on the students who had laughed, making a few of them glance at each other suddenly unsure. Then, slowly, she smiled. Not out of amusement, but with a quiet, knowing confidence. She had been in this position before, facing students who thought power came from privilege rather than knowledge. She could have snapped back, could have demanded respect, but that wasn't her way. Instead, she took a step forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and folded her hands in front of her. "That's an interesting perspective, Ethan," she said, her voice smooth, measured. "Since you're so confident, let's put that confidence to the test." The murmurs in the class died instantly. Ethan's smirk faltered just slightly, but he covered it with an exaggerated shrug. "Sure, why not?" he said, pretending to be unfazed. Ms. Johnson walked to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. "I'm going to write a series of questions on this board. Topics from today's lesson, from history, from current events. You're going to answer them." The tension in the room thickened. Some students leaned forward in their seats, while others held their breath, sensing that Ethan may have just made the biggest mistake of his life. Miss Johnson turned to the board, her movements deliberate, as she picked up a marker and began writing. The soft scratching of ink against the whiteboard was the only sound in the room, the previous hum of amusement now replaced with sharp, focused silence. The students watched with anticipation as a series of complex, layered questions appeared, topics that required more than just surface-level knowledge. Historical revolutions and their socio-economic impacts, the consequences of wealth inequality, how power structures shape society. Each question was a direct challenge not just to Ethan's knowledge but to his misplaced confidence. Ethan leaned back in his chair, still wearing that smug grin, arms crossed over his chest. "That's it?" he scoffed. "All right, let's do this." He stood, adjusting his expensive blazer as if preparing for a casual debate rather than an academic test. Miss Johnson stepped aside, gesturing toward the board. "Go ahead, Ethan. Pick any question. Enlighten us." Ethan sauntered toward the front, scanning the board, his grin unwavering. He pointed at one question. What were the root economic factors that led to the collapse of the Roman Empire? With an exaggerated Shrug, he turned back to the class. Easy. The empire got too big, people got lazy, and then it fell apart. Next! A few chuckles echoed from the back, but Miss Johnson didn't react. She simply clasped her hands together and tilted her head slightly. That's an oversimplification. Try again. Explain the specific economic policies that weakened the empire. Ethan blinked, his smirk twitching. Well, they had bad leadership, right? Like corrupt rulers. Ms. Johnson remained silent, waiting. The room did too. A few students exchanged looks, some stifling grins, others shifting uncomfortably as the tension thickened. Ethan's confidence, once effortless, now seemed strained. His fingers twitched at his sides, his eyes flickering to the board as if the answers would magically appear. Miss Johnson finally spoke, her voice still calm, still steady. I'll give you another chance, Ethan. Or perhaps we should open the floor to someone else. Ethan scowled, frustration creeping into his features. Hold on, I know this. His voice wasn't as casual anymore. The weight of the class's attention was pressing down on him, the same way he had once enjoyed watching others struggle under his scrutiny. A hand shot up from the middle row. Sophia, one of the top students, leaned forward, eager. May I answer? Ms. Johnson smiled and nodded. Go ahead. Sophia turned to the class, her voice clear. The Roman economy collapsed due to over-reliance on slave labor, massive inflation due to the overproduction of currency, and unsustainable military expenses that drained their resources. When the empire could no longer sustain its conquests, their economic model failed, leading to widespread poverty and division. A moment of silence followed, and then scattered applause. A few students nodded in agreement, impressed by the depth of her response. Ethan, meanwhile, remained frozen at the front, his lips parted as if still trying to come up with an answer. Ms. Johnson turned back to him, arching an eyebrow. Anything you'd like to add, Ethan? Ethan's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. The smirk was gone. Ms. Johnson let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again, her voice carrying an unmistakable weight. Wealth can buy you a seat in this school, Ethan. But knowledge, that has to be earned. The class held its breath. Even those who had laughed with Ethan earlier now sat quietly, absorbing the moment. The balance of power in the room had shifted completely. For the first time, Ethan wasn't the one in control, and he knew it. The weight of Miss Johnson's words settled over the room like a dense fog. Wealth can buy you a seat in this school, Ethan, but knowledge, that has to be earned. Her voice was steady, calm, not mocking, not cruel, just an undeniable truth that cut deeper than any insult ever could. For the first time, Ethan had no comeback. He stood frozen at the front of the classroom, his usual smirk completely gone. His hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tightened, but there was nothing he could say that wouldn't make him look even more foolish. He had played this game 100 times before, always the one laughing, always the one leaving teachers flustered, but this time he had lost. The class remained eerily silent. Even the students who had laughed along with him earlier now sat, stiffly in their seats, unsure of how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how quickly the dynamic had changed. A few of Ethan's closest friends exchanged awkward glances, realizing there was no way to save him from this moment. At the back of the room, the teacher's assistant, who had watched the entire exchange unfold, let out a slow breath. She had seen students challenge teachers before, but never had she witnessed a response so effortless, so powerful. She knew Ms. Johnson had just accomplished something far more significant than just putting a rich, entitled student in his place. She had shifted the way every student in that room viewed respect, authority, and intelligence. Ethan swallowed hard and finally turned back toward his seat, keeping his head low as he walked. The silence followed him, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he sank into his chair, he could feel the stares of his classmates, not with amusement, not with admiration, but with something that stung even worse. Pity. Ms. Johnson let the moment settle before finally speaking again. "All right, class, let's get back to the lesson." But everyone knew. The real lesson had already been taught. In the days that followed, something changed in the atmosphere of the classroom. Ethan was no longer the loudest voice in the room. He no longer leaned back in his chair with that smug grin, no longer made snide remarks when Miss Johnson spoke. Instead, he sat quietly, eyes focused on his notes, actually paying attention. The shift was subtle, but noticeable. Some students whispered about it. Was it shame, or was it respect? No one could tell for sure. The rest of the class had changed, too. The students who had once laughed at Ethan's jokes now listened more carefully when Miss Johnson spoke. They no longer dismissed her presence as just another authority figure. They saw her for what she was, someone who had earned her place through intelligence, resilience, and grace. Even the ones who had never outright disrespected her began to sit a little straighter, answer questions with more thought, and actually engage in discussions. It wasn't just the students who took notice. A few faculty members had heard about the incident, whispered in the teacher's lounge about how Ms. Johnson had handled the situation without raising her voice, without punishing Ethan, but simply by letting the weight of knowledge speak for art itself. One teacher even stopped by after class one afternoon, nodding in admiration. "That was masterful," he said simply before walking away. But perhaps the most telling moment came 2 weeks later, after class had ended. The students packed their bags and filtered out, some lingering to chat, others heading to their next lesson. Ms. Johnson was gathering her things when she noticed someone standing near her desk. It was Ethan. For a moment, he didn't speak, just shifted on his feet, as if debating whether to say what was on his mind. The arrogance was gone, replaced with something else, something quieter. "Miss Johnson," he finally said, his voice lower than usual. "I had a question about the reading." She looked up, searching his face, and saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine curiosity. He wasn't trying to impress his friends, wasn't trying to challenge her. He just wanted to learn. Miss Johnson smiled, nodding as she gestured, for him to sit. "Go ahead, Ethan." In that moment she knew. The real lesson had been taught. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned through knowledge, strength, and dignity. Ms. Johnson didn't need to raise her voice or exert authority to prove her worth. She let intelligence speak for itself. In a world where power is often mistaken for privilege, she reminded everyone that true authority comes from wisdom and self-control. Ethan walked into that classroom believing his status made him superior, but he walked out realizing that knowledge is the real measure of greatness. Have you ever seen someone put arrogance in its place with intelligence? Share your story in the comments. Do you think privilege shapes how people treat authority? Let's start a conversation. If you loved this story, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in the power of intelligence. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories. You won't want to miss what's next.